Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Lemick, the founder of the Wounded Workforce. I am so excited to have our final panel discussion of 2023 today, and we have some phenomenal panelists joining us as always. Today's topic is a special one. Today, we are talking about compassion fatigue and secondary trauma, which oftentimes is overlooked when we think about trauma and how it presents in the workplace, especially when we're not talking about helping professions like first responders, individuals working in hospitals. But really, compassion fatigue and secondary trauma can show up in any workplace or in anyone. So we'll kick things off by introducing our fantastic panelists. I'll have them introduce themselves, and I'll go ahead and I'll go clockwise this time, and I'll kick off and have Catherine, you introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Catherine Manning. I'm the author of The Empathetic Workplace, 5 Steps to a Compassionate, Calm, and Confident Response to Trauma on the Job, which has a lot in it on secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. So I'm super excited for this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Geraldine, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this conversation, Stephanie. Really love and honored to be here. My name is Geraldine Roberts. I'm a leadership development consultant and practitioner, as well as a self-discovery coach. Currently, I work at Target as a leadership development consultant. And outside of that, I do self-discovery coaching, really help people self-discover as a way and a path of growth, development, and healing. And so super excited to be here today.
Absolutely. So glad you could join us and happy that we had a chance to connect
Yes.
and our shared passion on trauma-informed workplaces. So this is awesome. And Jamie, I'll let you round us out.
Hi, I'm Jamie Conrad. I'm the VP of People at Trust Radius. We're a decisioning platform for tech buyers. I've been in the HR industry and profession for almost 16 years now, and have seen all kinds of things working in HR. Specifically, been working in the tech industry for about 2.5 years. Prior to that was in healthcare during the pandemic, and have a lot of experience with some of the topics that we're about to get into. But really respect what you're doing and the work that you're putting out, Stephanie. So appreciate the opportunity to be here and part of the conversation.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. I'm so appreciative of you all, and I am sure we're going to have an amazing conversation. For those of you who have been listening into our panels, I love to start from a place of shared understanding. So I'll go ahead and introduce the topic, and then you won't have to hear from me as much, and we'll start to hear from our panelists and some answers to our questions. Let's start with an overview of what we're talking about today. And I love introducing this topic with a quote from Dr. Naomi Rachel Remen. The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting us to be able to walk through water without getting wet. Love that quote. I think it is very representative of what we're talking about today. So secondary trauma is also referred to sometimes as vicarious trauma, is the emotional and psychological impact that results from indirectly witnessing or hearing about the traumatic experiences of others. It arises when individuals are exposed to others' trauma narratives, graphic details, or traumatic events through stories, medias, or even their job duties. When an individual empathetically engages with the trauma narratives of others, it can create a deep and lasting change in beliefs, worldview, and or emotional well-being due to repeated exposure to the trauma experiences of others. You may be more familiar with the concept of compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue, empathetic strain, or caregiver burnout pertains to the physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion that can arise from prolonged exposure to the suffering and distress of others. It develops when individuals consistently and empathetically engage with people who are experiencing trauma and emotional pain. Secondary trauma and compassion fatigue can overlap and coexist, and individuals may experience varying degrees of each depending on their specific circumstances and the nature of their role or work. So, today we're going to dive in and talk more about each of these concepts, how they may show up for us in our lives and for us in the workplace. And I know, some of us having worked in the HR profession throughout the pandemic, having worked in healthcare throughout the pandemic, really have some, very specific personal examples as well. So, very grateful to be able to tackle this important but sometimes challenging topic with you all today. So let's dive in, and I would love to hear from each of the panelists a little bit more about why this topic is important to you, either personally or professionally or both.
I can start. So this topic is important to me from a personal lens because, I've been directly and indirectly impacted by trauma. But from a professional standpoint, this is an important discussion because I think outside of those industries where these topics are normalized, there are so many people experiencing these, but they may not have the language or the awareness that these concepts exist, right? And so I think this conversation is really important because it helps people feel seen, right? And validated in their experience and their feelings. And so just bringing awareness to these concepts on, what they are and ways to mitigate and minimize the impacts of them are super critical.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I personally have experienced secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. Most notably, I would say in my 20s when I was doing direct service work at a domestic violence shelter, and really had to leave that work because I was not able to kind of maintain the boundaries that I needed to. I sometimes make light of it and I say I would have ended up with a house full of women and children, which I think probably was true. But also it was just, I was flattened at the end of every day and just developed this deep sense of hopelessness that I now recognize was a sign of compassion fatigue. And in my work now, I do a lot of training and consulting for organizations on supporting employees and community members, customers in trauma. And I've seen the effect among people who are working closely with those in trauma. I'll never forget, I did a training not long ago for law enforcement officers, and I talked a little bit about compassion fatigue, and I said it can manifest in a diminished ability to feel. And a guy in the back of the room started to laugh, and he said, I haven't felt anything in years. And I just was so struck by that. I'm grateful that he was honest about it, but also struck by how sad that is for him and for his family, and how I'm sure it affects his ability to do his work. We need humans. We need the full range of human emotion to be able to do our jobs effectively. Certainly when we are in jobs where we're serving the public or where we're repeatedly interacting with people in trauma. So I think it is essential to talk about secondary trauma and compassion fatigue and to take it seriously. Like, I love that quote that you started off with, Stephanie. I think we have to recognize that we are not the unique people who aren't touched by this. Like, we are all touched by it. So we have to learn some strategies to deal with it effectively so that we can continue to be our full selves and thrive in our personal lives and at work.
I think Catherine just indicated there why I didn't go into social work, because I would have had a house full of people that I was trying to save along the way in my mind. But this is a highly important topic for me, not just because of what I experienced with the pandemic and working in the hospital systems and seeing the impact that had on our nurses, on our physicians, but also for our HR professionals and as a profession as a whole. Recently, reports coming out that 98% of HR professionals are declaring that they're burnt out. And, that starts with a deep dive into, what is the why behind that, and looking at all of the different areas of stress that were associated during the pandemic that HR was asked to step up and help with. And it hasn't really stopped since then. So we've got this momentum that we've started to build as a profession, and in helping to figure out the human aspect of people at work. And it's at the expense of our profession and our well-being sometimes. I worked as I went through some of those, coming out of the pandemic, and then social unrest, and then war overseas, and like all of these different things, and having conversations with other HR professionals about how they're working through some of these situations, not just in the workplace, but as a human being as well. And making sure that they're setting some of those safe boundaries. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of those professionals decide to step away from the profession, as Catherine indicated. I don't want to see that trend continue, right? I want our profession to continue moving in the right strategic direction, and I'd hate to lose the momentum that we've started to gain, even if that momentum was gained in times of unrest and challenge. So how can I help? How can I be part of the conversation? How can I help break down some of those stigmas around compassion fatigue, around what people are experiencing, so that we can continue to have the impact and the momentum that we've been experiencing in the last couple of years?
I mean, as a HR professional who left HR in 2022, absolutely everything you're saying resonates with me, Jamie. And I love what you're saying. We have to find a way to move forward. Otherwise, we lose all the wonderful momentum we've gained. So I'd love to hear from the group. When any of you feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts. But I'd love to hear if you can provide examples of situations or professions where individuals may be more prone to experiencing secondary trauma or compassion fatigue.
I think that the kind of classic example would be healthcare and first responders. But I do think it's much broader than that. I mean, that statistic that Jamie just gave on HR professionals, that's stunning to me. But also, I've heard stories from HR professionals that make me understand why that is the case. I think I'm dealing a lot with teachers and college professors who are experiencing a lot of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. I feel like so often individuals are put in situations where they're being asked to do things that they were never trained for, they didn't receive the tools for, but they are the front line. They're the person that people come to when they're struggling. And so they're having to kind of put it together without a lot of support. And when that happens, when you haven't had the education or been given the tools to be able to manage it in a healthy way, I think that's where you end up more at risk for compassion fatigue.
In addition to those industries and those professions, I also want to highlight some of our theologists and our preachers, our reverends, the people that we go to for help and for spiritual guidance. They take on a lot, and I can relate to some of that. But I think it's important when we're talking about seeking guidance and trying to settle ourselves spiritually and center. If we go to someone that's in that spiritual realm or in that religious realm, I think that's also a profession that deals with compassion fatigue a lot. I don't know what kind of training and rigor they go through, but I can only imagine how their conversations turn out at the end of the evening.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And librarians too. Librarians are dealing with so much right now. They're kind of the front lines for everything that the community is struggling with. Yeah, thank you, Jamie.
To that point, it makes me think about like even some of those non-traditional roles, like leaders in corporate America, right? Like the role of leaders are really shifting the more and more societal moments happen, right? And so there's sentiments from leaders in corporate America around like, I feel like a therapist, like I don't have the skills for this, right? Like I wasn't trained to support my team members in that way. And so, really, I think the stat is around like 70% of people have had some kind of traumatic event in their lives. And so thinking about that, right? Like the probability of someone experiencing secondary trauma is huge, right? And so even leaders in corporate America, which you may not think about when you come to compassion fatigue or secondary trauma, are experiencing these things, right? And these concepts may feel foreign in those environments, and but it's happening. And so I think even some of the non-traditional industries that don't come to mind are actually experiencing these things too.
Yeah, it's such a great point. And in my work with corporations, it's interesting. Sometimes I have to talk a little bit about what trauma is and how it shows up at work, but almost everybody, after they hear a little bit about it, has their own story of either something they themselves experienced or a time. Like these are honestly the stories I hear most. A time when a coworker was going through something and they felt like they didn't show up in the way that they wish they had. And they now, 20 years later, are still kind of carrying that with them as a regret that, when this person really needed me, I wasn't there for him. And it kind of goes to your point, Sherilyn. I feel like you think of your job as a manager as like, I got to hit the budget. I got, like I need to do the hiring. Like you're not really thinking about the mental health support of your team members, but it's certainly an important part of your role. And I think a lot of employees expect that of their manager, whether or not the manager has the skill set to do it.
And jumping off of that just a little bit more, Geraldine, I really appreciate you bringing up the corporate and the mid-level managers and some of those conversations. I don't know, when we think about specific professions, I don't know that anybody wasn't touched in a stressful way during the pandemic. And when we look at, there's a list from experts in the 60s of all the different stressors that people can experience. And there's a point scale that's associated with that. And they've done research on how those stressors then relate to mental health and chronic illness and some of those types of things from a wellness standpoint. When we look at just the things that we had to deal with during the pandemic, we were all already at the halfway mark of those points, just experiencing it together. And so I don't think there's any of us that hasn't come out of that experience already at a heightened level of compassion fatigue and how do we deal with this, and how much is too much, and where are we going to be able to kind of slide back down and not have all of these stressors associated with the pandemic. And like I said in the beginning, it doesn't seem like it's really slowing down too much with all of the different things that are happening in the world. And that just really reinforces why it's so important that we have these conversations and that we provide people with the tools and the psychological safety to be able to have the conversations around what they need, why they need it, and how we can best support them along the way.
Absolutely. So wonderful. So we've talked about, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue can really touch just about anyone. But it's really hard sometimes for folks to recognize it in themselves and others. So, how can individuals recognize the signs of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue, both in themselves and in their colleagues?
I think first, in order to really even recognize these signs, it's really about that self-awareness aspect. Like, are you attuned to your mind, to your body, to be able to realize and recognize when something may be off, right? What is your normal, and how do you know when you're not operating within that normal? And I think similarly to that, to be able to recognize that in a colleague or even a friend or a family member, it's about building that relationship of trust. And as Jamie talked about earlier, that psychological safety. Do you have a relationship with that person to be able to call that out in a way from a place of love and caring, and have that kind of relationship and environment where they can be honest about where they're at and what they're feeling, right? And so, like I spoke about earlier, some of these concepts may not be normalized in certain communities, industries. And so sometimes it's more about less about being able to name what the thing is, but just noticing small signs that something is off, right? Like emotional exhaustion. Are you noticing increase in emotional reactivity, right? Or I think, Catherine, you mentioned earlier about the police officer who feeling numb and detached. Like those things, are those off of that person's normal?
Yeah, I think those are great signs. It's compassion fatigue can sneak up on you. It's not like a light switch. It's like slow growth. There was a guy that I worked with at the Justice Department who was a child exploitation prosecutor, and he was this great prosecutor, really great guy. We worked on a project together for a few years, and I just really liked him. And then the project ended and a few years passed, and then we came together again, and this time he was like a different person. Like he was really sarcastic and bitter and like very quick to anger over things that just seemed like normal roadblocks you would hit on any kind of project. And I finally realized that he was experiencing compassion fatigue, that all those years of working on those really awful cases had taken a toll on him. But I don't think I would have noticed it if I'd been working with him every day. I think the only reason it was clear to me is because we had that gap of a few years. It's like that expression, by the time you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. I feel like compassion fatigue is kind of like that. Like by the time you notice it, you've already probably been in it for a little while. So it is tricky to see those signs. I think, Geraldine, you talked about some great ones. Like there's physical signs like weakened immune system. I had a little while when I was at the Justice Department where I got bronchitis every winter. Every winter I'd be coughing for 6 weeks. And since I left DOJ, I haven't had it once. So it's like that persistent sore throat, the cough that won't go away. It's insomnia, stomach ache, the numbness, which is like both the numbness in response to hard things, like you read about a terrible thing and you can't get any kind of emotion, but also even on happy things, like it's a birthday party or it's, a holiday or something, and you kind of know that you should be feeling really happy and you're not really connecting with it. So I think it's just hard. We have to get better at noticing those subtle signs. Like, I'll just be honest. One of the signs for me that I'm starting to experience like compassion fatigue or burnout is that I start swearing a lot. Like I don't normally swear very much. If I start sounding like a sailor, I'm like, uh-oh, better pay attention to that. So it's like you were saying, Geraldine, it's like the change, for plenty of people, that is not a warning sign because that's the way they are every day. But for me, it's different. And so that's kind of the warning sign. We have to, like you said, kind of know what is our baseline, like what is normal for us, so that we can start to notice when we shift from that.
And for those people that we are close enough with to be able to notice those shifts and those changes, I think it's also important to acknowledge with them and give them permission to acknowledge it themselves, right? I've seen a lot of really great leaders where they will wall off the emotion so that they can lead through the trauma, lead through the event or the situation. But sometimes when things start wrapping up, you almost have to say, I see these changes in you, and I want you to stop and breathe for a second. and are you okay? And giving them that space where they can come out of that, let that wall down a little bit, and be able to process what they just led through or what they just went through. So I think that's important as well when we see those things, to provide the opportunity for somebody to acknowledge it, to talk through it, and then whatever they need to do to process.
Wonderful. We talk about how workplaces can support their teams, their employees moving through traumatic experiences or the impacts of traumatic experiences. So, what can organizations do, or what can they implement to support employees who may be at risk for developing secondary trauma or compassion fatigue, or who are already experiencing it?
Honestly, Stephanie, I think Jamie just hit on that. Like, that permission is so important. Regardless of that permission, we always encourage people to set your boundaries, right? But if you work within a bigger system that doesn't allow you to hold those boundaries, then that becomes even more stress put on that person who's already experiencing these, compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. And so, giving folks permission to hold their boundaries, to take care of themselves, regardless of if that's indirectly with wellness programs and mental health services, or directly by saying, take care of yourself, right? Like, as a leader, hey, take time off, right? Giving them permission to really express, and give them space and holding space for them to say, like, this is hard, right? And acknowledging and sitting with them in that hard, I think goes a long way. And so, before, we can implement all these different things, I think the permission has to be there. We can say, take the time off, but if we overload them with work, how are we actually enabling that to happen? And so, really focusing on that, the larger system that will enable those self-care practices to take place.
One of the things that I appreciated working in healthcare, and that I will take with me in my career everywhere, is don't wait for the crisis to happen before you have a plan, before you start developing a plan. During the crisis is definitely not the time to develop your plan. And so having a proactive mindset about these topics, having a proactive mindset around crisis management in general, and making sure that secondary trauma and compassion fatigue are included in part of your plan, talked about openly as part of the plan, and that those resources are provided as you go through the training associated with that plan, I think is highly critical, and can help to prevent some of those, not just secondary trauma from occurring, but secondary trauma that gets maybe overlooked or delayed, or the can gets kicked down the road a little bit, which leads to more trauma and more fatigue. Making it a point to have them as a defined part of the plan can help to proactively prevent some of that from getting too far down the road.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I do think it's important to have just the tangible resources in place, like make sure you have the flexible work policy and the mental health resources. I also think it's important for, like, I think of it like you need to engage not just in self-care, but in noisy self-care. Like, you have to model that it is okay to take the day off when you need it, to access the resources. Like, it is one thing if you're a manager and you say to your team, we've got phenomenal mental health resources and I hope that you use them if you need them. That's very different than we've got phenomenal mental health resources and they really helped me when I needed them. I hope that you'll reach out if you need them. Like, when we say the second one, we make it okay for everybody else. So I guess that would be my thing, would just to encourage people to have the resources in place, but also to talk about them in personal terms, like make it okay for people to access them.
I might have to steal noisy self-care. I like that a lot. That's perfect. Perfect.
I think that's really important too when we think about some of the shift to remote work,
Yeah.
right? And this loneliness and isolation that's starting to set in. How do you encourage that? And I love your example of just changing. The language is so important. The wording is so important, in order to have it land and make the impact that's going to be meaningful. And so practice that wording, right? And again, don't wait for that crisis to happen. I encourage people to practice that wording and what that sounds like and how that feels coming out, so that it becomes more muscle memory and natural in the moment when you have those situations where you may be trying to keep yourself under control and you may be trying to manage a situation with a wall up. But if the wording is already muscle memory and part of your language, then it makes it a lot easier to lead through that.
We talked about systems, talked about organizations and how they can support individuals experiencing secondary trauma or compassion fatigue. What tips do you have for folks who are experiencing secondary trauma or compassion fatigue for their own path for self-care or self-care strategies?
I think of it in like kind of multiple steps. It's like, what do you do in the moment when you are experiencing that secondary traumatic stress? How do you protect yourself in that moment? And then what are the strategies you're using over the long term? So for in the moment, your first defense is always going to be breath. Like just take a deep breath in through your nose, out through your mouth. It'll help a lot. Another thing that I think is really helpful is just to check in with yourself and name your feeling. Like you feel your heart rate start to go up a little bit. How am I feeling right now? Oh, I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm upset, sad. Like just literally putting a name to it can really help. It's you can remember it as name it to tame it. And then be willing to take a break when you need one. I think at work, we often push ourselves through because we feel like it's more professional. But when we do that, that's where we end up saying and doing things that we later regret. It's super easy. Just say like, thanks for, sharing that. I'm going to take a quick break. Do you want some water or something? It doesn't have to be a big deal, but give yourself that space to kind of check in and I don't know, rebalance yourself. And then I feel like this is one of those areas, best defense is a strong offense. Like you have to take affirmative steps every day to protect your mental health. Like treat it like your physical health. You brush your teeth every day to protect your physical health. What are you doing every day to protect your mental health? I will tell you what I do every day is every morning when my tea is brewing, that 4 minutes while my tea is brewing, I get out my little journal and I write down what I'm grateful for that day. It's 4 minutes. It is not a long time, but it gives me a little bit of centering to start the day and it really helps. So have some kind of thing that you do every day for yourself and also lean on others more. I think a lot of people are really, really good at supporting the people around them, but forget that those people are also there to support them. So, identify the people that you can count on and reach out to them when you could use some help. I'm sure will be thrilled to be able to support you.
I was going to share a couple things I would offer. I love, Catherine, how you broke it down like in the moment and then almost like recovery or prevention. And so in the moment, for me, what has been helpful is limiting my exposure to traumatic content to really protect my mental and emotional health. I live in Minneapolis. And so when George Floyd was murdered, it was everywhere. And I remember the video was everywhere and I had to cut myself off of it because it was just re-traumatizing me every single time and being in the same city, in the same space where all that was happening. So give yourself permission to cut yourself off because sometimes we have to do that. Right now, I'm currently on a social media break. So I have logged out of all my socials because it's just a lot emotionally and mental for me with all the things happening in the world. And so I had to give myself permission and also give myself permission not to feel guilty about cutting myself off from those things. And then Catherine, you alluded to this earlier about kind of a mind-body connection and that like what we're fueling our body with and how we're engaging in exercise or not does matter into our mental health. And so just being conscious about like, okay, if I'm experiencing compassion fatigue and secondary trauma, how am I like nurturing my body and what I eat and what I fuel myself with, and how I engage in movement and just, stress and relaxation techniques. And then the other thing is like, what brings you joy? Like really identifying from a prevention and recovery standpoint, what is something that brings you joy? And really give yourself space to do that. And so, like for me, I am declaring December as my month of intentional joy because I am been going through a lot. It's really been a hard season for me. And so, like I said, I'm taking a social media break. I'm watching all of the holiday movies. I'm reading holiday books and novels and things that just makes me gush because I love that. And so it's okay, even in the hard seasons, to feel joy and to find those things and to engage in those things. And sometimes that can feel hard because you're like, this hard thing is happening and I'm feeling joy. Like it can bring some guilt sometimes. And so I think just some self-compassion around that and being like, it's a both and, right? And so how might I intentionally create that space to feel joy, to fuel my body in ways that are nourishing, and to make intentional decisions on what I'm exposing myself to and what I'm not, where there is choice.
That's so good. And I just wanted to, I don't know, kind of play off of that final point you were making about experiencing joy, because I definitely hear that a lot from people. Like, well, if I'm not always looking at the images from Israel and Palestine, I feel guilty. And it's like, it doesn't help, right? Like you subjecting yourself to the secondary trauma and compassion fatigue is not actually helping others. There's this poem I love that has this line: "I'm washing my face while a country is on fire. It feels strange to wash my face and strange not to. It has never been this way, and it has always been this way." Like that has always been the case, that there are people in great suffering. And if we are waiting for that to end before we start to prioritize ourselves and our joy, like we're never going to get there. And by the way, we're not going to be as good at supporting the people who are suffering if we don't have that kind of fullness in ourselves. So I'm really glad you brought that in. Thank you.
Yeah, and that feeling of guilt associated with that, it's so powerful. I worked for an organization many, many years ago that instead of having like actions or commitments, we use the language of promises. We're making promises to each other that we're going to follow through, and it created an emotional connection for being able to be held accountable and relying on each other. And there were some great aspects of that, but there were also some really emotional aspects of that when you couldn't follow through on your promises for various reasons. And during my exit interview at that organization, I said, I love that we make promises, but what I get frustrated about is that I'm always put in a situation where I have to cancel the promises to myself in order to meet the promises and the demands of those promises for everyone else around me. And fast forward 20 years, I decide to make promises to myself as part of my normal schedule when I'm scheduling out the strategy for 2024. Some of those promises that I'm making to myself, some of those bucket list items that are going to not just make me feel good about what I'm accomplishing as a human being, but also refill my emotional bucket. Those are going to be promises that are going to be built into what I'm trying to accomplish next year. And the last promises to be kept are not going to be the ones that I feel like I have to cut for myself. Those need to be just as much of a priority. And so that, I think, can be really impactful. And then not let myself feel guilty if I'm going to go fulfill that bucket list item instead of figuring out that spreadsheet or having that conversation to support the person next to me that's also going through some situations that they need to take time off or they need to refill their bucket. It's okay for me to go refill mine in order to help others refill theirs.
Jamie, you are inspiring me. I'm now like, I'm going to do that too. That's a great idea.
It is. It's a really great idea. I love that. We hit on this a little, and I'm so glad because I think it is a very interesting dynamic of our modern world that definitely factors in to experiences of secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. And that is the increased availability of media and social media. And I would love to hear from all of you a little bit more. We've hit on it a little already. How in your experience can social media or increased media availability create an environment that leads to greater compassion fatigue or even secondary trauma? And how can individuals both stay informed and protect their mental health?
I don't have a good answer to that. But I can tell you, like Geraldine, I've gone through periods in my life where I've turned the news off for several months because I didn't want to be involved in any of that. I didn't want to know. I'm okay with not knowing. In order for me to be okay, I'm going to disconnect for just a little bit. I think that's okay. I don't have a great solution for it, though. I think we've entered into an era where we expect to have everything at our fingertips, and it should be easily accessible. So I almost feel like when we think about, and this is how I'm approaching it for myself, since I've turned the news back on recently. When I go in to watch the news, there's almost a moment of pause and, okay, I know that most of what I'm about to hear is not going to be positive. And so having that awareness before I turn on the newscast or before I click that link and follow that news article, I'm going to pause just for a second and allow for there to be just a moment of space where this is not me personally. I'm going to put a little bit of distance between me and what I'm about to experience. And in an effort to continue to stay informed. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I think a suggestion I would offer is to give yourself some parameters, right? And so if you want to stay informed, maybe you're saying, okay, today I'm going to spend 10 minutes and I am going to go to a news source and read an article. For me, I know seeing videos are very hard, but being able to read about something to be informed is a little bit easier for me to consume without spiraling. And so I'm turning off my notifications because I don't want my phone buzzing every time a new article happens. But I'm going to spend 10 minutes, go through a couple of news outlet articles, read, okay, I'm informed, and then I'm done for the day. And so just, again, it's about the kind of that self-discovery work and self-awareness of like what works for you. What for some people, videos might be okay. For me, I know that that is really hard for me. And so if I am starting to notice symptoms of compassion fatigue and secondary trauma or just emotional stress, I may limit myself on, okay, I can read an article, but I can't watch a video. I'm willing to spend 10 days, but I'm not going to be scrolling. Like, and so really putting those parameters around yourself is a good way to stay informed while cutting down on the social media.
I think that's such a good idea. And it's about kind of knowing yourself again, right? I'm like you, Geraldine, like I still to this day have not watched the murder of George Floyd because I just know it would be something that would stay with me forever. And I think kind of recognizing that film can have that kind of impact. You know, I read this interesting article about the filmmakers who made the movie Till, which is about the murder of Emmett Till. And they did it in a very trauma-informed way where they were cognizant of, like, we are putting out into the world imagery of a young Black man being murdered. And let's think about how we're doing that. And they made sure that there were moments of light and joy and hope in the movie as well. So you would see something hard and then there would be a little bit of a break. And they said it was partly because they knew that people need a chance to process. Like, you have to be away from it for a second to process what you've just observed, or else you become desensitized to the violence. And so I think it's important for all of us to think about. That's why I like your idea, Geraldine, of like, I'm going to give myself 10 minutes, or I'm going to give myself one article, and then I'm going to walk away from it for a little while. I'm going to look at the sky. I'm going to pet my dog. I'm going to have a little bit of more light in my day, so that I can really engage more thoughtfully, rather than doing it in an unthoughtful way that just leads to desensitization.
I love that. That is so fantastic. I know for me, like, I love to turn off the notifications. This bad boy right here, the Apple Watch, I had to turn off every news notification to my Apple Watch during the pandemic because I just could not anymore. So those little things sometimes can have a huge impact. It looks like we are almost out of time. I can't believe it. The hour always goes too quickly. So I always love to end with this question, and always get such amazing recommendations for myself. So probably I like to end with this question selfishly, but I would love to hear from each of you. You know, if someone is interested in learning more about secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, anything else you think is important related to self-care, organizational processes and systems, do you have any recommendations for books, articles, podcasts, or any other media or trainings?
Yeah, I'd just like to share that if you haven't gone through the process of obtaining your mental health first aid certification, that it is very much worth it. It's worth your time. It's worth the time that you put into it for the people around you. It was new to me this year. I spent the time to get that certification, and it's made me feel like a more empowered leader. When I find myself in those situations, I feel more confident, because that's where a lot of this all stems from, is the fear too, of how do we show up, as Catherine was talking about earlier. I have regrets of not showing up in the way that I would want to. And that's one way that I was proactive about trying to break down that barrier within myself and feel like I could show up more holistically, and in the way that I wanted to for individuals. So I would be happy to share resources, and people can reach out to me if they'd like. But that mental health first aid certification is worth the time investment.
I feel a little funny saying it, but I would recommend my own book, which is The Empathetic Workplace: 5 Steps to a Compassionate, Calm, and Confident Response to Trauma on the Job. There you have it. Thank you, Stephanie. I should have a copy, or I don't. I am actually excited to announce that I am launching an online course based on the book that will go live January 8th. And if you go to my website, you can check that out. That's catherinemanning.com. And I would say I get a couple other books that I really have enjoyed in this kind of area and found really fascinating. One is The Body Keeps the Score, and the other is What Happened to You. Those are both just really, really phenomenal books. Actually, What Happened to You, I would recommend doing the audiobook, because the audiobook is just amazing, and it's something you can listen to as you're driving around or going for a run or whatever it is you do.
Yeah, those are all really good. The one resource that I would add to everything that's been said already is really doing some research and looking up the ring theory. So this concept was developed by Susan Silk, who's a clinical psychologist, and it really it advises those surrounding a person like in crisis to direct their expressions of their own feelings around it and stress toward those less close to that person or less close to the traumatic event. And so it really helps you orientate yourself to where you are as it relates to the traumatic event. And the idea is comfort in and dump out. And so I'm not going to express and vent my feelings around whatever the event might be, to someone who's impacted more directly to that, I'm going to offer comfort in. But that doesn't mean I don't have feelings, right? And that doesn't mean things are not coming up. And so I will direct those to someone who's further away from that traumatic event. And so it has really been like an excellent tool, a teaching tool, but also a personal tool. And there has been times, honestly, where I have literally drawn circles and said, okay, this is what happened. And where am I in relation to that? So that I'm not causing an additional harm to those who have been more directly impacted by an event or a crisis than I am. And I think that's very, very important, because that doing harm to someone who's already been harmed is never the intent. And so this is just a good tool to have in your back pocket for that concept. So the ring theory.
I love that. What amazing recommendations. And literally, this book is really always by my desk. Like, this wasn't like I didn't plan this. It's always nearby because it is such a good book. I'm obviously a Catherine Manning super fan. But it's so fantastic. So I'm super excited for the course. Thank you all so much. This was such a beautiful conversation. I am so grateful to all of you for sharing your expertise and your experience. What a lovely way to end the panel series for the year. And for those of you listening in, Happy New Year, and we'll certainly have more to come in 2024.